gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, to you the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, you the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme amongst humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies formed supremely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. Savior having great compassion, the founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you the one gone to thusness I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path of sublime pure reality, the karma that pacifies I prostrate. Those who are liberated and who also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you the sublime community intending virtue I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devout homage. To all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms, atoms, in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. As a star is an elaboration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, or a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See compounded, conditioned things as such. To these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, to do the 4 faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem, thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling in Master Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form is not also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no composition, no factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on up to including no mind element, and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell on the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration, without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint in nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to the unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment and the reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequal, the mantra that thoroughly passes all suffering should be known as the truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Tayatam gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhi soham. Shariputra, the bodhisattva mahasattva, should reign in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan rose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Aryavalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that, one should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. Bhagavan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Aryavalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the worlds of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, overjoyed, and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. Tayata om gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhi soha.
This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon, I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. O holy and perfect pure Lama from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Guru Ratnam Mandalakam Niryatayami.
And we do refuge prayer. I go for refuge into light into the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create, teaching the Dharma, may I become a Buddha and the benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge into light into the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create, the teaching the Dharma, may I become a Buddha and the benefit all sentient beings. For refuge into light into the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits are created through teaching the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, so then again, we just can sit quietly for a couple minutes to get fully centered here. Okay, so welcome back again, everybody. Here we are on the second day of the teaching. So we'll continue again with the introductory parts to this morning, and probably get into the first part of the actual text as well. So a couple of things I thought to mention after the talk yesterday. One is that, of course, I think most of you know that we talk about the path to enlightenment, and we say mainly it requires two different facets, two different causes to achieve enlightenment. Some people call it the two wings of the bird. Actually, it's Chandrakirti uses that analogy. So these are merit and wisdom. And within the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva, it's mainly the first 3 or 4 that constitute the merit accumulation. That's generosity, ethical discipline, and patience. And then the 4th one being joyous energy or enthusiasm, which can be either merit or wisdom. It's needed for both. So of course, this teaching is more geared towards the wisdom aspect. There was a lot of talk yesterday about very complicated philosophical topics. But I think it's always important to remember that needs to be grounded also in the practice of ethical discipline, the practices of patience, generosity. That this philosophy, it's considered like a sharp weapon, and so if you're not careful, it's dangerous. It can be used for many different things. Nagarjuna says in his root wisdom, it's like by wrongly holding emptiness, the feeble-minded wreck themselves. Like wrongly handling poisonous snakes or wrongly casting magic spells. So if you're not careful, it will turn around and bite you. And so the idea here is that if we take this teaching to mean that cause and effect doesn't exist, that's really considered the main danger. That it doesn't matter what I do because everything's empty, then this is really missing the point. Nagarjuna says that again and again, that really the meaning of emptiness is dependent arising. That if you understand emptiness properly, you'll understand that things depend on other things. And therefore, every action you do, even the slightest action, has an effect, not just physically, but on your mind, and then later on your experience. And the deeper your understanding of emptiness, the more that will become clear. So many of you probably know in Shantideva's text, the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds. So the 9th chapter of that text is about wisdom. That text generally is much more geared towards the merit side. It's more about practice. But there is one chapter on wisdom, and in the first verse of that chapter, Shantideva says that all of these branch topics were for the sage, the Buddha, taught for the purpose of wisdom. So the branch topics being all of the other perfections. So it's not like you practice them to get wisdom and then you abandon them. The point is that they are necessary for wisdom. You can't really gain true wisdom if you can't control your mind. It's not like you can gain a lot of, study this a lot and, write books about it and have a really good intellectual understanding without any grounding in practice. That will not really help your mind very much. But that ultimately, as he says, it's all for the purpose of wisdom, because without wisdom, just the practice alone, just meditation and just practicing ethical discipline, although it's a good thing, it won't free us. And then he goes on to say right after that, therefore, in order to pacify suffering, generate wisdom. So that's the purpose of wisdom. That comes into what I was saying yesterday about the purpose of debate, right? That it might seem sometimes like when we're making debate points that we're being very hostile. Yesterday, I was a little bit critical, as I mentioned, of Harari, the author of this book, Sapiens, although I said it in general is an excellent book. There are a few points that I feel it's useful to criticize, and that's not to be taken as criticizing a person. It's to be taken as wishing to understand how things exist, and therefore we need to have examples. Here's an example of what could be a wrong view that we could also adhere to. And that will certainly come up today and shortly as I talk about the philosophy of mind and modern theories of mind, comparing them with Buddhism. So the purpose of this for us as Buddhists is something we're very used to in the monastery. So maybe other people, it might seem foreign, but we get often very heated when we're discussing philosophical points. But that's just part of our lifestyle here. It's something that if you come to the monastery, you'll see that nobody carries a grudge outside of debate. It's just something, it's like a game that we play together in order to help each other understand. And then also Tsongkhapa talks about, might know his teaching, the three principal aspects of the path. So he says, if you don't rely on the wisdom that realizes the way things exist, then simply renunciation of samsara and bodhicitta, the wish for enlightenment, no matter how much you meditate on them, you cannot cut the root of cyclic existence. So therefore, rely on a method to understand dependent origination. So this is a very dense phrase, but the main point, first of all, is that merely through compassion and renunciation, we can't achieve liberation. We can't cut the root of existence because the root of existence is ignorance. So that has to be cut through understanding the way things are. Now, I think understanding the way things are, we say it means understanding emptiness, but it's a lot more than that. And that's why Tsongkhapa, he doesn't say, therefore, make effort into meditating on emptiness. He says, therefore, make effort into understanding dependent arising. This is a major point in the Gelug of trying to understand what he meant by that. Why did he say that? And the idea is manifold. There's not just one answer. But one way to see it is that because if we understand dependent arising, then it's very easy to understand emptiness. And then the other way around is that the purpose of understanding emptiness is to understand dependent arising. So it's not that we understand emptiness and then leave behind all worldly wisdom. It's that the more we understand emptiness, the more we can understand how things actually function on a conventional level. And so that's very relevant today as well. It's not like something that was an ancient religious concept. There's still many, many unanswered questions about how we exist, who we are. This is what I'll talk about this morning. And so if we understand emptiness, then it's understood that we can understand what these mean. So especially in terms of Chandrakirti's interpretation of Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti says that he doesn't use the word 8, but he brings up in his text 8 points that Tsongkhapa identifies as being very difficult points in Buddhist philosophy, that if we understand emptiness, they fall away, the problem falls away. And so 2 of them are very important within this text. One is the issue of what we call commonly appearing subjects, and one is the issue of self-cognition, whether the mind can know itself. And especially this latter one, self-cognition, I think is very relevant in the context of the debate today about what is mind? How does it relate to physical matter? And I think insight into emptiness would hopefully allow us to gain a better insight into what's going on here. And also I'll discuss some of the current views and why they might have flaws according to this system. Also, I was thinking yesterday because somebody, I think like Angita, asked a very good question and pointed out that I was getting a little ahead of some people's level of understanding now. And so I think, it's important to remember, we have the Bodhisattva vows. One of these vows, the root vow, is not to teach emptiness to a person who's not ready to understand it. So it's a bit difficult because I don't even see most of you on the screen. So how am I supposed to judge what your level is? So it's a bit questionable. It's hard to know. But I think, one way to see it is that this is a very general presentation. I think people can take from it what they are able to do and understand that this isn't meant that there to be instructions that you therefore go off and meditate in a cave on emptiness. This is to give an idea of what's being talked about. And if you're interested, then you can pursue it further And certainly, it might be that I get far beyond what people are, people's current level. Some of you might be more beginners in terms of understanding this. You might not have the whole background of some of the concepts I talk about, some of the people I mentioned. So in that case, again, it's very good to please tell me, ask questions and say, or even just write in the chat right away. I don't know who that is that you're talking about, or what was that word you used, and I'll try to clarify it, because it's quite likely if you don't understand it, other people don't too, and I may forget, because in the monastery, this is kind of how we talk on a regular basis, talking about Chandrakirti, Bhava Viveka. They're just like household names here, but for many of you, it might be new. So that being said, let's move on with the actual presentation. So I'll open that. So as we stopped yesterday, introductory topic 1, philosophy of language. So I mentioned in this introductory part, we'll have a couple introductory topics. The idea being here that there are really two major topics within the Dispelling debates text that are major topics in Madhyamaka philosophy. And so rather than just immediately diving into them, I'll give a general introduction to what's going on here. So I mentioned just a minute ago about commonly appearing subjects and self-cognizers. So commonly appearing subjects is very much related to philosophy of language, and self-cognizers is related to philosophy of mind. So once we get to those, hopefully I can refer back to these introductory points. In terms of philosophy of language, I think many people might not realize that the field of linguistics, which seems quite straightforward, it doesn't seem like it's as mysterious as, for example, quantum physics, actually is a field where there's still some major unanswered questions in modern times. So some of you might know a little bit of the background. I think many of you might know the name Noam Chomsky. He's become so famous, not just for his linguistic theory, but also for his political views, some of his writings. But up until Noam Chomsky first wrote his important thesis in 1957, the general view in philosophy, in linguistics, was about how children learn languages. Was not very well developed. It was based mainly on the behavioral theory that many of you might know, behaviorism. Especially it was by B.F. Skinner in America was one of the major proponents of this. And this was, they say, kind of the citadel, the stronghold of psychology up until the 1950s. And so a lot of theories of how people's minds work was based on this. And now it's mostly not very much accepted. It's understood that there were a lot of flaws in this theory, although it had some value, certainly, like the Pavlov's dogs experiments, all these kinds of things. But in any case, the field of linguistics was based on behaviorism. It was understood to be that we could understand how children learn language merely through behavioral psychology. But Noam Chomsky challenged this with what he called the paucity of stimulus. That if we look at children learning language, it's simply not possible for a child to learn a language as fast as they do. It's quite a mystery. Children do not hear enough language to be able to form an entire theory of grammar. Yet children who speak rarely make grammar mistakes. They'll make mistakes in their speech, but they won't make major mistakes with syntax. For example, when I say, I am going to the store, they won't say things like, I store going. It's in some languages, like in Tibetan, we say that. You say store first and you say going later. But the syntax that children learn, it seems to come quite quite naturally for them. So Chomsky's theory was what he called the universal language instinct, that there's something there's some kind of underlying programming in the brain based on genetics that allows for learning language. And so this was a revolutionary theory, and it said that this field of linguistics was really what took down the behavioral paradigm. It made Chomsky very famous when he was quite young. And then for the rest of his life, he continued to propound this theory. I think he's still alive, actually. I haven't heard recently, but last I heard he was in his 90s. But even this theory eventually ran into a lot of problems. One of the main issues is just as I just mentioned, that, for example, in English, I say I'm going to the store. In Tibetan, I would say I too store going. So if there's a universal language instinct that's inherent in all of us, how can it then adapt to different languages? A child born in a Tibetan family learns Tibetan, and a child born in an English family learns English. So this is still a debated issue. Some people still adhere to Chomsky's theory, but a lot of people say that this doesn't work, but there isn't necessarily a better theory to replace it. There are a lot of different theories out there. But it's still a big question about what is language and how do we, the relation of language to mind, especially. We form concepts of the world based on our language. It affects how we conceive of the world. And this is a major topic in Madhyamaka philosophy. In Buddhist philosophy in general, in Indian philosophy, you'll see that this is the main debate here between Nagarjuna and his Nyāyā, the Vedic opponent, followers of the Vedas. So just one thing I had mentioned, one person had once brought up, I think is actually something really useful to think about. This is not the main topic here, but from a Buddhist perspective, there is a different answer to this, which would be that children learn language based on karma. That if a child has learned a language in a past life, then it comes very naturally. They don't have to hear every single phrase, but as they hear things, they have a natural propensity for it, which is explicitly taught in the Buddhist theory of karma. Now, someone might object, well, some children have a hard time learning a language, but Buddhism could reply, well, some children, they were born Tibetan in one life, and then they're born as a Westerner in the next life. Or they were born as an animal in the previous life, and they never spoke a language at all. So it's very, very difficult for them to develop a language capacity. So this is one possibility. And certainly both sides in this coming debate, both Nyāyā and Nagarjuna, both accept that. It was pretty much taken for granted in India. I shouldn't say taken for granted, but it was something that almost all philosophical schools accepted. And they were arguing on that basis. So within this argument, it's helpful to understand that the basis of this is why do we conceive of the world in terms of language? And both of them understand it to have becoming from imprints in the mind. The question is, where do these imprints come from? And Nagarjuna and Buddhist theory in general would say that even though there is karma from a previous lifetime, it's not like a program. It's just something that we learn gradually over many lifetimes. Whereas the Nyāyā theory is much, we call realist. As they say, it's based on the Vedas. And it's understood that the Vedas and the text were revealed text. They weren't something somebody wrote. They were simply inherent in the nature of things. And so therefore the Sanskrit language itself is actually inherent in the nature of reality. And that the way we learn language is based not just on imprints in the mind in a sense of habit, but in terms of becoming in tune with the way things actually are. The names for things, at least the Sanskrit names, are really existent things that correspond to particular objects. So here we start then, we see the Garden of Eden. So the reason I've put this in here is to show a very basic sort of naivist view of language. The idea that Adam and Eve were born were created in the Garden of Eden, and all the things that already exist are there for them to name. They're just waiting to be named. So here's a white thing, we call that a horse. And here's a yellow thing, we call that a lion. figures. It looks like a camel over on the left side, I think. So it's as though it's not like they had to come up with concepts of things. The concepts were already preformed. Everything already existed in a particular way, and it was all categorized. It's just a matter of putting a name to that concept. So this is, you say, the realist view of language. So next we have Nyāyā philosophy. So again, I should emphasize, I'm not an expert on Nyāyā philosophy. It's not something that we study separately. The only way we study it in the monastery is through the arguments against it, especially by Dharmakirti, and then also in texts like this by Nagarjuna. But I try to read a little bit about it because it's very useful to get some background. It gives me an advantage to be able to speak English because most of my classmates, as I mentioned yesterday, these texts were never translated into Tibetan. So all we have is the Buddhist presentation of them. But there's some good presentations in English, and I'm sure there's much better ones for people who can read Sanskrit. Maybe in Hindi, I expect there's many modern presentations of these, because Nyāyā philosophy is the background, the logical background for a large part of modern Hindu thought. So yeah, I haven't used the word Hindu yet, because as some of you know, the word Hindu was only coined about a few hundred years ago by British, I believe. The people east of the Indus, India, and the Hindus. But in ancient times, there was no concept of Hindu religion. But there were people who followed the Vedas, the tradition of the Vedas. And then there were those who didn't follow the Vedas, like the Buddhists and the Jains. So the Nyāyā was definitely a follower of the Vedas, and we're trying to create a philosophy based on the Vedas and to defend the Vedas, the authority of the Vedas. So in this philosophy, generalities or categories exist substantially separate from the particular instances that we experience. So when we say a generality, it's like, for example, we think of a pot. This is our usual example that we like to use in Buddhist philosophy. So if we have a pot, that's a generality. There are gold pots and clay pots and iron pots, all different kinds of pots, but there's a generality called a pot that all of these instantiate. So in the Buddhist philosophy, there's no such thing as a pot apart from the particular instances of a pot. It's only a concept. We create the idea of a category that subsumes all of them. But you can't find any such thing as the real pot that's behind all of them. Whereas in this philosophy, it's quite the opposite. There's a thing called a pot. It's what they call let's say a chidon shen, we say in Tibetan, which means a generality which is of a different categorical nature from the what substantiates it. So it's something that exists at a subtle level that we don't see with our eyes, but we can infer it through reasoning, and we can eventually experience it through mental consciousness, not through the sense consciousness. So as I understand it, even because there were many schools of Vedic philosophy that use the Nyāyā logic, especially Vaisheshika was the main one. Oftentimes it's almost grouped together as the same school. And also the Mimamsa school, also followers of the Vedas. And as I understand it, in some schools of Mimamsa, they even have the concept that if you weigh a pot, in a scale, it weighs a little more when it becomes a pot. So for example, you're making a pot. It's not a pot yet, it's just a half-made pot. Once it becomes a pot, then it substantiates the generality of pot. So it has a little more weight because it has this category that it's substantiating, which seems a little extreme. But this is how they understand it, that the pot substantiates all the different categories. So as we say, number two, thus the concepts that we form are not arbitrary, but access non-physical realities existing a priori to our thinking about them. So there's a right and a wrong. This is a pot, it's not a pillar. It's not something other than, it's correct to call it a pot, or actually it's better to call it the Sanskrit name. It was Badamga for pot, I think. So for example, a horse, we say Ashva would be the Sanskrit name. The word Ashva actually exists in the horse. It's like it's sound, so it's like a subtle vibration that exists there in the horse. And people who are very highly attuned can hear that. And this is how the Sanskrit language was revealed. It was not something that evolved. It was revealed to people who had very strong meditative concentration. And then third, thought consciousness engages objects that already exist, much like sense consciousness. So in Buddhist philosophy, when we have sense consciousness, it's called that the object cast aspect. I see something that it sends light rays to my eyes that causes a reaction that I have a visual consciousness. So it's not like I'm creating that experience myself. It has to do with the object it's giving something to me, sending something to me. But when I have a thought consciousness, it's merely a mental imputation. It's something that I myself create the appearance based on previous sense experiences that I've had. But here it's understood that at least correct thought consciousness, not like wrong views, but ones that access what is actually true, access a real thing. When I think about a pot, that's the generality of pot beyond the gold pot and the clay pot, I'm actually accessing a real category that exists beyond just my mental appearance of it. So the names, Sanskrit names, inherent objects, inseparable from these categories. So this is what I mentioned, that the Ashva, it exists in all the horses. If it didn't exist there, then how could we say that it's correct to call this an Ashva and wrong to call it a Bala, which would be a cow? So it sounds in our modern times, and this seems like a very silly. I think a lot of people might find like it's quite contrary to the modern view. Whereas in ancient times, they said almost everyone believed reincarnation, and the people who were materialists, who believed that everything was purely physical in nature and there was no greater reality behind that, was really a minority. Whereas today it's quite the opposite. Especially people who have been educated with Western education. Even though it's very rarely explicitly said that things are material, unless you take a philosophy course or a philosophy of science, it's very much implicitly understood. It's sort of a lot of discourses take that for granted, that everything that exists is purely material, or at least physical. And for example, an electric field might not be a material thing, but it still has a physical nature. But we have to look at certain questions that come up here from that. So we could eliminate the definitions of convention of ultimate truth. Well, yeah, I see this. I'll come back to this certainly when we have time for question and answer. It's not directly related to what I'm saying now, but I will come back to it. So we have here the picture of a cow fetus, right? So a question that these philosophers were asking is, this cow fetus doesn't look like a cow, especially as the smaller you get, the less it looks like a cow. So how does it grow into a cow? How does it know how to do that? So the understanding here is that it already possesses this generality of cow, bala, which is cow. And therefore, it gradually, that generality guides its development in a particular way. Now, again, a lot of people will say, well, now we know it's true that that's DNA. It's got DNA in it, cow's DNA, and that guides its development. But actually, I think this is taking too much for granted. It's definitely true that there is DNA and we can identify cow DNA. However, the question is, how does the DNA know to grow into a cow? So for example, we can read the DNA, genetic scientists can read DNA and identify certain characteristics of whatever organism possesses that DNA. But we can only do that because we know of other DNA. So for example, this DNA is similar to that one, which has these, an egg organism has these characteristics. It's not like we can read it like we can read a language, where we can see something that's totally unfamiliar, but because it's in a language we know, we can therefore decipher it. So it's still actually a bit of a question. How, and for example, we have DNA in different parts of our body, but they develop in different ways. So how is it programmed and who's reading the program? So these are the kinds of questions that these philosophers were asking. And this Nyāyā philosophy came up with the idea of something over and above the physical that was guiding these processes, that was related to some underlying thing in reality. And so some of the followers of this philosophy believed in a creator God who created all of these, and some of them didn't. Some of them believe that these naturally inhered in reality, but it's not as though somebody designed it per se. It's simply the natural way things are. There's no other way it could be. So particular instances at a subtle level are reflections of these higher orders of generalities and names and instantiate them. So I think I've explained that, that all of these things that appear to us are simply a reflection of a more real thing that's underlying them. Some of you who know of Western philosophy might recognize that this sounds very similar to Plato's idea of ideal forms. You might know the myth of the cave, that people are sitting in this cave looking at shadows on the wall, and this is their entire world. But actually, they don't realize that it's because the light is shining from outside, and all they're seeing is shadows of the real forms that exist. And so somebody exits the cave and goes out into the light, and everything is so much more clear and real. It's the understanding that our ordinary reality, our ordinary experience of reality, is simply a reflection of a much greater reality. So this is very similar in some ways to Buddhist understanding, except that there's important differences that I'll explain. That a lot of these schools in ancient India believed in that our ordinary experience is flawed, and therefore we need to find something deeper that's more real, that therefore we can achieve liberation from suffering. It's because of not seeing things as they are that we're suffering. Certainly the Vaiseshika school and the Samkhya school and the Buddhists all agreed on this. Some didn't. For example, the Mimamsa school I mentioned also was followers of the Vedas, but did not believe in liberation. They believed that it was not possible to completely be free of this cycle. But then the Jains also had an idea of liberation. So they had different ways of seeing this. And the Buddhist understanding is that this is very critical, that it may sound similar, but there are important differences that if we don't recognize them, we can actually get on the wrong understanding. And here, especially the understanding that somehow behind, so if we see a horse here, that these horses that we see are mere pale reflections of the ideal horse, which is much more real behind all of them. World of ideas. It's permanent and it's perfect. It doesn't have all the flaws of a horse with a broken leg, or a horse with pale skin, or a horse with not a perfect form. It's exactly what a perfect horse would be. And that's what we experience when we think about a horse. We think about the ideal of a horse. So for Buddhism, this is quite wrong. It's a very reification of our ordinary concepts rather than a way of going beyond them. But at the same time, it has some. It's a step beyond simply taking our experiences for granted, saying that everything that exists is simply exactly how it appears to our normal sense consciousness. So I don't know if Plato had any interaction with the Nyāyā philosophy. Plato was actually closer to the Buddha's time, and Nyāyā philosophy was later. There was no written language in India even at the time of the Buddha. Although I remember when I was in high school, my philosophy teacher was of the opinion that Socrates and Plato had been influenced by Eastern philosophy, which I suppose is possible. Certainly Plato traveled in Asia quite a bit before he wrote a lot of his books. So then we have this question, what's in a name? So here, here's where we get to a problem with this idea of a one-to-one correspondence between names and objects or categories. So we have the English name pot and the Tibetan name Bumpa. So is it the case that this is, we say Bumpa, is it exactly what a pot is? We'd say, well, we just translate Bumpa into pot in English. But the problem is that they're not coextensive. So it's true, when we say pot in English, we could mean any of these four things in the middle, and those would also be called Bumpa in Tibetan. But on the left-hand side, we see, for example, a cooking pot. In Tibetan, we would not call this a Bumpa. This is actually, they call it a hayang now, which is a Chinese word they've adopted since the Chinese invasion of Tibet. But in any case, they would not call it a Bumpa. It's not something, because something you cook with is not a Bumpa. And likewise, these pots that hold flowers is a different thing. In Tibet, we call this a karshong. It's something that you put a tree in a pot and it grows. But then the word Bumpa, now I don't know, in English, will we call these on the right-hand side? Will we call this a pot? This is actually, when we say Bumpa, this is the main thing. Probably when a Tibetan thinks Bumpa, this is what they're thinking about. This is, we'd call an action vase in English. It's a ritual object. I think people would find it strange if you called it an action pot. It doesn't sound right. And likewise, here we have a flower vase. I don't know, would you call that a pot? I think usually we think of a pot as more round and not so tall, maybe not made of glass. I guess you could say a glass pot, but I think usually we'd say a vase in this case. And we wouldn't say, oh, a vase is just a synonym for a pot, because certainly this hot cooking pot is not a vase. But in Tibetan, both of these would be Bumpa. So here we see that it's not as though the world is just waiting there for us to name it. We come up with particular concepts and then fit things into those concepts, based on similarity, essentially, what we consider to be similar. But we're making the concepts. We're making the divide between there's this category, and it includes this, and it doesn't include that. So I think this is probably familiar to any of you who've learned second languages. Now in America, unfortunately, we don't learn second languages very well because I guess one way you could say it is because we don't experience much of other cultures. In America, you can go for hundreds or thousands of miles without encountering anybody who speaks a different language. So the first time I started learning a foreign language, I was 11. We started learning French in class and in middle school. And I remember when I first came in, I thought, well, all this is going to entail is learning a new vocabulary. We just learn a bunch of new words and replace the old words with the new words. But pretty soon you learn that it's nothing like that at all. It's not only a different grammar, but a completely different way of conceiving of the world. And French is not that different from English, although as a youngster in America who had not ever learned another language, I had actually been out of the country, which a lot of my classmates probably hadn't been. This seemed very foreign to think of French way over the Atlantic. But compared to when I got older learning Tibetan, it's quite similar to English. Whereas once having learned Tibetan, I start to see that some people think of the world in a completely different way. Even when they say world, the word that we use in Tibetan for world, we say zamling or zambuling, which is a translation of the ancient Indian term Jambudvipa, which means rose apple land, which was a reference to India, the southern continent. So Tibetans could traditionally conceive themselves as living in the southern continent. This was the world. Later, they encountered modern thinking and began to accept the idea that we live on a planet, although some of them still do not accept that. Even some of the more educated ones within the traditional system will argue that the world cannot be round, cannot be revolving around the sun. But then they decided to call this Zambuling. So now we call Earth Zambuling. But also we have the idea of the universe, the entire universe. They also use the word Zambuling for this. So when we say world, what do we even mean? And in English, maybe it's not clear either. We say world, do we mean Earth or do we mean the whole universe? So all of these things, the way we conceive of who we are and where we exist, are based heavily on our language and our culture. So next we have the question of self-existent categories. This is just what I was talking about. Do the categories exist before we name them? So the first comparison here is between French Indochina and Indonesia. So let's see. There exists a potentiality. This is one of the on the chat. Let me see. Okay, so there exists the potentiality of the DNA to become a cow and not a horse. Did Nyāyā refer to that as a potentiality at all, or just explained it by the existence of God? So actually, I'm not sure. As I say, I don't know their philosophy exceptionally well. I don't think they would use the word potentiality. I think they would say that there's or say the tani, which means like the actual horse or the horseness in there. So it's not so much a potentiality as something that's already, waiting to manifest. But whether it's the existence of God, I think, as I said, that would depend on the different Nyāyā philosophy, or not, the people following, because Nyāyā is really a system of logic. Different people utilize this. So like in the Samkhya school, for example, it's a little different. There's an understanding that there's what they call the cheat soul, I think, prakriti in Sanskrit, the underlying essence of everything. And this exists equally in everything. It's not that there's one individual category for each individual thing. So Puruja is the person, and prakriti is the underlying essence. And so, actually, I'll talk about that in the last talk. I want to mention about Puruja a little bit, because this is a different concept of liberation. But I won't get into that now. But the main point is that there has to be some reason, something that causes this development. And so one idea is that each individual thing has its own essence, and one is that everything has the same essence, which is sort of orchestrating this. Where again in Buddhism, it's quite different. That there is a cause, but it's not something that exists in any more real way than the physical world. There's something else underlying it that's just in a dependent, interdependent interplay with it. So I don't want to get too much off the topic here, but these are, as I said, these are very good questions. And as I say, I'm not a totally expert on this either. So certainly I'm just bringing these up as things to think about and to see how relevant these questions still are. So here we have French Indochina and Indonesia. So actually what we could say is there's French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, which about 70 years ago, maybe more, maybe 100 years ago, we could say, that's what these areas were called. But nowadays, they're very different. But the one difference is that the place that was called the Dutch East Indies still exists as a coherent entity, as Indonesia. Whereas French Indochina is now 3 different countries. We have Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. So how did that happen? So it might seem, well, all the people in Indonesia, they were from the same culture. So of course they formed a single country. But actually before the Dutch conquered, actually it was a Dutch company, a Dutch entrepreneur conquered this area. It was not one country. There were many different islands that spoke different languages and had different cultures. And they all became one entity under the Dutch East Indies. And similarly, the French came to this area and called it French Indochina and made it all a colony of France, but they all spoke different languages and had different culture. So when the French left, they decided to revert to their traditional cultures, and people would find it offensive if you said, oh yeah, you're from French Indochina. If you're a Cambodian, you're a Vietnamese, they're basically the same. It's considered quite different. They have completely different cultures and different languages. But in Indonesia, it was decided to stay as one entity and actually to form a new language, a common language to all of them. So now we have this idea of this one entity. Indonesia is one country with one common language. At least they might have individuals they speak, but Indonesian itself is one common language. So this comes simply from our conception of things. We therefore call this one category, and that has consequences in the world. We could say, oh, it's just a way of thinking, but obviously it has major political and economic consequences and social consequences, all kinds of things based upon how we identify ourselves. Therefore, people from one island in Indonesia will say, oh, we're from the same country, we share a common heritage, even though 100 years ago that was not the case. We therefore come to identify ourselves together. So next we have Jews. So here is a picture of me, actually. So my father is Jewish. So I'm not actually a practicing Jew, but from heritage, Jewish heritage. Originally, not originally, I should say, but our family came from western part of Russia. So would you consider me a Jew? So certainly, for one thing, only half Jewish. And actually, according to Jews, I'm not a Jew because my mother wasn't Jewish. This is the criterion, because you can always be certain who the mother is. You're never sure who the father is. So therefore, you can't really count this person as a Jew. But had I lived in Eastern Europe, actually had my great-grandparents stayed where they were, which is actually, I think, in the Ukraine, then maybe they would have been in danger, because according to Nazi Germany, we were Jews. You classified these people as Jews because half Jewish considered Jew. I can't remember exactly the criterion for it. I think it may have been 1/4 or even 1/16. So if you make a policy or a concept that all Jews are inferior, well, where are you going to draw the line? So you have to say, well, we consider somebody who's 1/4 Jewish to therefore be inferior. But then one person who's 1/8 Jewish is not. So we see how arbitrary this is. Once we start in believing that our categories of things actually exist in the things, we come into all kinds of problems. So on the right-hand side there, you see Edith Stein. I don't know if any of you know her. She was a Catholic nun, but like me, although she was not a practicing Jew, she came from a Jewish background. So according to the Nazis, she was Jewish and she was executed. She was living in Holland. So we see, again, that we believe in some kind of concept and think that therefore it exists externally, and we can quantify it. Now, most of us today, see racism as a thing of the past, or I mean, it's not that it doesn't still exist by any means, but as something that is no longer acceptable in a politically correct society. Whereas in the past, it was quite acceptable in a lot of societies, not just in Nazi Germany. But we might have a lot of other concepts of things that function similarly, that we take for granted. In the past, it wasn't seen as anything strange to segregate people based on race. So on the right here inside here, we have mothers. So we use the word mother in English. Here's a mother with her baby. That's what we mean by a mother. So then we have the planet Earth, and some people say Mother Earth, but it's understood to be a metaphor. The Earth is not really a mother, it's like a mother, and therefore we call it a mother. But in the language of Navajo, Navajo is a Native American group in the southwest of the United States, the word Shimra, which we translate into English as mother, actually it could mean any of these three things. You're the woman who gives birth to you, the world you live in, or a flock of sheep. Or it can mean actually many different things, but the point here is that anything that sustains you is your mother. So the woman who gave birth to you and raised you, and also your aunts and your grandparents, probably your uncles too, I suppose, they're all your mother. And this flock of sheep, because these sustain your life, this is also your mother. And actually, the world you live in is the primary mother. This is really your most important term appellation of the term Shimra. So we would say, well, no, it's just a broader category. But the thing is that they don't have a separate word. You can't distinguish the woman who gave birth to you, linguistically, at least without using other concepts. You say, well, the mother who gave birth to me, or the mother who, I don't know if maybe they'd say the earth gave birth to me too. But the point is that we, in our English language, we therefore consider this a fixed category. It seems very natural to us to think there's your mother and your father. These are two things that exist, and we just gave the name to it. It was just waiting there to be named before we named it. And then the planet is something totally different. We could use a metaphor, but it's not a mother. So then another example of this on the bottom here, we have different cultures and their conception of directions. So right and left, for example. This seems very natural to us to think in terms of right and left. But actually, it's been found that among Australian Aborigines, there is no concept of right and left. Direction is north and south and east and west. To the point where if you take somebody and put them in a dark room with no point of reference for north, south, east, and west, they can still very clearly identify which is north, which is south. Most of us can't do that even if we're standing under the sun, because we don't think that way. We think in terms of right and left. It's actually been shown that some young Aborigine children who learn to write, who were raised in the traditional culture, we write in English from left to right. Of course, there's nothing inherent about that either. In Hebrew, we would write from right to left, but it's very natural to us to do so. Whereas these Aboriginal children, depending on which cardinal direction they're facing, they'll write in a different direction. So if they're facing north, perhaps they'll write what we would call right, left to right. But if they're facing east, then they would write top to bottom, because you taught them to start. So you start them to start from the west point and draw to the east. So now if you're facing to the east, now you're drawing from behind you and writing forward. So it's very hard for them to learn to always write in what we call left to right. And this, of course, this is going to affect significantly how they conceive of the world they live in and how they function. Again, these are just things that we take for granted. It's not only Aborigines, it seems. There's also some groups in South America. Probably I would expect a lot of more traditional groups that live in hunter-gatherer societies that don't have writing, because maybe our concept of right and left really is coming from our concept of writing, going from left to right, I'm not sure. That are more, it's necessary for them to always be aware of what is north and south. Also concepts of past and future. So like if we talk about the future, we say we point forward. In the past, we say behind me in the past. Whereas some cultures actually have the opposite. They'll say back then, not back then, I would say that, but they'll say like when I was a child, they'll point forward. And then they'll say in the future, they'll point backwards. So again, actually they brought this up at the Mind and Life conference we had at Sarah about 6 years ago when His Holiness was there. It was quite interesting, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, how perceptive he can be. Immediately when the woman gave him the presentation said this, he said, well, that's because what happened in the past is no longer a mystery. It's right in front of you, you can see it. Whereas what's coming in the future, you don't know what's coming, so it's behind you. And the woman said, actually, you're right, Your Holiness. That's what that is. If we ask them, why do they think that way? They say that's the case. So maybe that seems more natural. Why do we have to think of the future as in front of us? What does it exactly do that mean? So I think this is the end of the presentation on philosophy of language. But I think, as I say, just to keep this in mind, because this, in the first major section of the text, this is what the debate is about. How can we, if it's the case that these things are only relative, then how do we distinguish a right from a wrong statement? How does language refer to anything at all? If Indonesia wasn't waiting there for us to be named, then what does Indonesia refer to at all? You can say, well, it refers to that country in the Dutch archipelago, but of course that doesn't answer anything. That country, all it implies something there. As you remember yesterday, I was talking about with the basis of designation, that ultimately when we search among the bases of the designation, we can't find the thing. And even the collection of the things itself does not constitute the thing. This is the important point. That based on a particular collection of things, we therefore have this concept that appeared to our mind. But it's not that the collection itself appears as being that thing. Again, this people would argue, well then, how can we talk about anything? We can obviously understand our language very clearly and be referring to the same thing. When I talk about Indonesia and you talk about Indonesia, we're talking about a similar thing and we can understand each other. How can that work if Indonesia doesn't really actually refer to anything that we can locate? So next we have theories of mind. So I mentioned I will talk about some of the popular theories of mind today. As I mentioned, in the modern world, as I think a lot of you know, the idea of materialism is very much taken for granted. And when I say materialism, specifically what I mean is that everything that exists is physical. So therefore, there cannot be any cog in the wheel of cause and effect that is non-physical. It's what scientists would say we call supernatural. The idea that there's some kind of force that's acting on the physical that's non-physical. It would actually be considered incoherent, because how can it exert a force in the physical realm if it itself is not physical? Simply by exerting that force, it must exist physically. It also relates to what we call the closure principle in physics, that everything that exists in the universe is closed. There's a closed system wherein things are functioning. There's nothing outside of that system. If there was, then we couldn't make predictions, because things would all of a sudden, I'd have the table and all of a sudden it would fly up in the air because there's some object, there's some force acting on it outside of our ordinary system. So within this system, which really draws back to Newton's theories, although I mentioned yesterday, we know that Newton's theories are not ultimately correct, but they give a very good approximation of how things function at the macroscopic level. Although Newton himself actually believed in a God who was outside of this system, later people interpreting it came to realize that that didn't really work, that it was self-contradictory to have such a conception. And therefore, there's nothing outside of this system. And that therefore must negate that there's any kind of mind outside of that system. That when we say mind, it has any kind of existence beyond the physical. And therefore, mind must simply be a product of matter, or must be matter. And this is still an unanswered question. Do we say that mind is a product of matter? Is it something that is the same as matter? And if it's a product of matter, is it something that is matter still, or is it something different than matter? And if it's different than matter, can it exert a force back on matter, or is it only a one-way causation? Can matter act on mind, create mind, but mind has no causal efficacy within the world of matter? Or is it that matter creates mind, but then mind can there come back and work on matter? But then, of course, that becomes the same problem. And there's something outside of the physical realm that would seem to violate the closure principle in physics. So this is a big debate today still. It's often presented as the hot topic in mind science, or in psychology, or in science in general. It's like they say the next frontier of mind. However, I think if we really look at it, a lot of the debates going on today are not that different than the debates that were going on 150 years ago, where even then most scientists assumed that mind was physical, and therefore The corollary of that must be that mind comes from the brain. Where else could it come from? We only see mind in structures that have brains. And most importantly, if we damage the brain, there's clearly damage to the mind. So it seems that mind is in the brain, or is the brain, or is somehow related to the brain. But it's interesting that I say that even 150 years later, this is still a question. It's certainly the case that 150 years ago, we had almost no understanding of how the brain functioned. It was extremely primitive. Now, if it was the case that we knew exactly how the mind relates to the brain, there should have been some major breakthrough in those 150 years, where someone discovered that this is what the mind actually is, and this is how the brain creates it. But that still hasn't happened. There are definitely there's a lot more data about the brain than there was 150 years ago. But for one thing, as the scientist Richard Feynman mentioned, he had the famous quote that if I cannot recreate something, then I don't truly understand it. So as far as I know, nobody has created a mind in a laboratory. Some people argue that with computers, we're creating that, but I think that's a very debatable question, and I certainly don't agree with that. We have to ask, even if a computer can fool us into thinking that it's a mind, and it has a mind, does it still have a mind? This is also a debated question in science. And also, so if we don't have a theory of what mind is, we still, as I say, in all of the theories I'll present, there's still the assumption that it must be based on the brain. So I mentioned yesterday, in the context of the book *Sapiens* by Harari, he says that we haven't a clue how the brain gives rise to the mind. So he admits that quite openly, and actually most scientists will admit that, even most cognitive scientists. So it's clearly not understood how this happens, but it's assumed that it must happen, because if it didn't happen, for one thing, there's no alternative, and secondly, that it would have then the issue of something being outside of the physical realm, and therefore contrary to the understood laws of physics. And this, people will say, well, it's not a philosophical point, it's a scientific point. Really, when we talk about philosophy, it's a way of making sense of what we understand through perception. This is what Buddhist philosophy is understood to be doing. So science can take us quite a ways in terms of examining what we can perceive. But then it's up to philosophy to therefore make a coherent framework for understanding all the data that we have. And so philosophy is very relevant if we still don't have a coherent theory that explains the data. And certainly we don't have any theory that explains how very simple things like, how can I raise my arm? How can I make that decision? There's no one theory right now, like there is for a theory of, like I mentioned about fire yesterday. Why is fire hot? The understanding of combustion explains that pretty well. But why do I experience heat? There's not any one accepted theory for that. So the field is open for different possibilities. And Buddhism has a philosophy of mind that it purports to explain how this happens. It certainly does not take into account a lot of modern science from modern data about the function of the brain. But personally, I think that if we take it as a hypothetical framework, it's very useful for considering a lot of the problems. So I want to just mention some of these, and then when we get into the text, the second major section of the text is about epistemology, which is specifically about this. So here I've borrowed from this book here, you see, The Spiritual Brain by Mario Beauregard, who is a neuroscientist in Montreal, who is a non-materialist. He's one of the few very prominent non-materialist neuroscientists who believes that the mind is not a physical thing. It cannot be explained through simply physical matter. And so this book that he wrote is about his argument for that, why he believes that that can't be the case, both through reasoning and through a lot of evidence for that. But in this book, he provides a very good synopsis of the major theories of mind today. So I've just borrowed that from him here. So the first one is called epiphenomenalism. Phenomenalism. So epi means like over and above phenomena. Mind is something that's over and above our ordinary phenomena. And actually, it seems probably the first proponent of this was the British scientist Thomas Huxley. So this is why I say 150 years ago. So 150 years ago in Britain, he came up with this idea. See, mind does not move matter. So this is a modern philosopher, or modern neurologist, C.J. Herrick. So the mind exists like a rainbow shimmering over the falls. Yes, it's there, but it doesn't affect anything. You know it's there because some experiences are unique to yourself. For example, whatever you personally associate with peanut butter. Merely a product of brain-body processes, the mind sometimes facilitates for itself the illusion that it affects those processes, much as if the rainbow thought it affected the falls in some way. So this, as I mentioned, is the idea that the matter gives rise to mind. Mind is not matter, but mind has no causal efficacy within the world of matter. So therefore, it does not violate the principle of physics that nothing non-physical can affect the physical realm. Yet at the same time, it posits that mind is not physical. So it actually has no effect at all. So on the right-hand side here, you see I have the picture of a steam engine. This is Thomas Huxley, because he, at the time, this was a major, the cutting edge technology was the steam engine. So he had the idea that the mind is like the steam coming out of the engine. The engine's like the brain doing all the work. The mind is nothing. It's just superfluous. It's just the steam coming out. And then the example that you see used today is like a rainbow over the falls. It's a phenomenon, but it has no actual effect. So we have the illusion that we are in control. That somehow there's somebody here controlling, that I'm making decisions to do something. But actually, it's merely the brain doing all of these things, like a computer. And somehow there's this consciousness outside of that that's aware of it happening and has the illusion that it's making the decisions, because it experiences the brain making the decision, and it feels like somehow I'm doing that. William James, who was a great philosopher of mind, many people consider him the greatest American philosopher, who was contemporary of Huxley. His main criticism of this idea was that he said, why would nature create something, evolution, because at this time they had the idea of evolution. Why would evolution create something that has absolutely no use? Evolution only supports things that become efficacious, things that function well, that then give some kind of survival advantage. They persist, but things that have no use, there's no reason for it to persist. Now, it's actually true within evolution. There are things that evolve that have no point per se in terms of survival. But at the same time, this idea about mind, why would something evolve that has no precedent in the history of the universe? What's the point, and how does it work? How does that happen? So this is an idea that has to therefore be proven. Again, a problem with this scientifically is that it's unfalsifiable. If you say that mind has absolutely no relation to the physical realm, then how do you prove that? You have to have some kind of experiment and could say, if this was true, we should have this result. If it was not true, then this other result should happen. But you can't test that. And the biggest issue is that it's completely contrary to our experience. This is Mario Beauregard's main argument. The idea that we have absolutely no control of what's happening. This is actually a problem with almost all of the modern theories of mind. although they may not consider mind to be a non-physical thing like epiphenomenalism considers it to be, a lot of them hold on to this idea that we are making decisions and having some causal efficacy in the world is an illusion, because it's just simply not logically possible. It's contrary, given the data of science, there's no way we can square that with the idea that there's some person making decisions and moving matter. So the next view is eliminative materialism. And one of the main proponents of this is, we see on the left here, Daniel Dennett, who actually I have a personal connection with. Daniel Dennett was my teacher and my advisor when I was in college, Tufts University in America. So I still consider him my teacher. I learned a great deal from him. Obviously a very intelligent person. This is why he's so popular today, because his arguments are very coherent. And he definitely, in terms of eliminative materialism, if it's true, if it's the right theory, he certainly is the one who's presenting it most coherently. Whether it's right or not, as I say, I would disagree with it, but certainly in terms of what implications it would have, he is the one who has spelled those out most elaborately. So we see here, we now understand that the mind is not, as Descartes confusedly supposed, in communication with the brain in some miraculous way. It is the brain, or more specifically, a system of organization within the brain that has evolved in much the same way as our immune system evolved. So for one thing, as I said, he says, now understand. This is something so when I was a student, this was over 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago now, I must say I really never challenged him very strongly, because I recognized his views, his understanding was far beyond mine. He had been studying these things for, I was 20 at the time. He would have been almost 70. So he had been studying this for a lifetime, and there wasn't a lot I could say to challenge his ideas. Even now, I feel I'm not quite adequate to the task, but I feel a little bit more like I can make some comments on it, and hopefully as the years go on, I can make more coherent statements. But one thing is, now understand implies that there was some point where we discovered that Descartes was wrong, that the mind is not in communication with the brain, but it is the brain. But as I said, I don't see any point in the history of science where it was definitively shown, oh, actually the mind is the brain. It's rather, if we look at history, it's something that we gradually adhered to this idea. And nowadays it's basically taken for granted, but there was no time when it was definitively proven with one experiment that would say, okay, if the mind is the brain, this is what result we should get. And if it's not the brain, this is the result we should get. Now the argument would be, well, we have gathered so much evidence for the mind being related to the brain, that if we damage the brain, there's such and such effect. That's certainly true. And certainly, Dennett generally is identifying what he calls dualism, the idea that the mind is separate from the brain, with Descartes. This is also an important point. Descartes had from a Buddhist perspective, it was a very coarse philosophy. It was not very refined. And so if you believe that the mind is different from the brain, the way Descartes believed, then it is really not logically possible. So then if you identify that viewpoint with Descartes, then you must think that viewpoint must be wrong. But in this philosophy, there doesn't seem to be any other way of the mind being different than the brain other than to take Descartes' philosophy, which I'll explain in one of the next slides. And then it therefore believes that the mind is like the immune system. It's something that evolved to help the organism survive, or like the digestive system. He also uses that example. It's something that it has an effect, and it works in a fairly cohesive way together to accomplish a function. But there's no difference categorically. It's just, the nerves that then become more and more complex that create a system that functions to allow the body to propagate itself and to continue evolution. So the mind-matter problem is resolved by denying that mental processes exist in their own right. Consciousness and mind, intentions, desires, beliefs, etc., are pre-scientific concepts that belong to unsophisticated ideas of how the brain works, sometimes called folk psychology. They can be reduced to whatever neurons happen to be doing, whatever the neurons happen to be doing, neural events. Consciousness and mind as concepts will be eliminated by the progress of science, along with ideas such as free will and self. So then its understanding is that when we talk about mind, we're talking about something that doesn't exist. We have this concept based on our wrong ideas of how things are. For example, he says, in the past, people had the concept of sky. Nowadays, we know that actually there's a lot more going on. If you go out into space, there's all kinds of things out there. But we didn't understand that. So we just referred to it all by this one notion of sky. Likewise, when we talk about mind, it's actually a very complex process within the brain. And we say a desire, it's what we call a folk belief. Really what a desire is a certain kind of process in the brain that if we can identify. And it's not just one thing, it's very complex. But we just call it desire because we don't understand the underlying process going on. So again, what I'd argue against here, from I think Nagarjuna's understanding, is very similar to what I said yesterday about fire. So we might argue that, well, we now understand that fire is really combustion. But does that relate in any way to our experience of fire? Is the combustion of molecules hot? And are they glowing? Does that have any relation to, it can explain how it happens. We can explain, we can see on the microscopic level there's combustion, so therefore there's fire on the macroscopic level. Definitely a correlation between them. But is the combustion itself fire? The microscopic reaction among the molecules, is that fire? So likewise, if we can explain a process in the brain that correlates with a particular experience of desire or intention, is that the same thing as the desire? And I think Nagarjuna and certainly Tandakirti would say this is a misunderstanding. This is the basis of designation of the thing. It doesn't mean that it is the thing. Just like the people, the buildings and the people don't constitute Peugeot. The existence of Peugeot is a different thing, and then the individual things like the buildings also are constituted of other smaller entities or other parts of themselves, but those entities don't constitute the thing itself. So simply by breaking something into its constituent parts, you don't necessarily explain what it is. Now, another thing in Buddhist philosophy is that we would understand that the basis of designation of desires and other mental experiences are more than just the physical manifestation. But even if we just take it to be the physical manifestation, it's still problematic to identify the basis of designation as being the thing, and to say that therefore Peugeot doesn't exist because we can break it up into these parts. And therefore here to say mind doesn't exist because it can be broken down into constituent parts. However, as I say, this is a very well-developed philosophy that a lot of people today adhere to. Secondly, we have psychophysical identity theory. So this is a little different, although fairly similar to eliminative materialism. States and processes of the mind are identical to states and processes of the brain. We apprehend our consciousness and mental processes in the first person, that is, in a subjective and experiential manner. Brain events, however, are measured in the third person, that is, from the outside, in an objective manner. Brain events and mental processes are completely parallel, like the two sides of the same metal. The underlying assumption is that brain states create mind states, not the other way around. So here I mentioned we could have that the brain creates the mind and the mind is separate from the brain but doesn't affect the brain. Or we could have Dennett's argument that actually there is no such thing as mind. There's only brain states. And when we say mind, we're referring to something that's a misconception about how things function. Or we could have the idea that the brain and the mind are the same thing, which is essentially what's being said here. It's one thing looked at from two different angles. So it's not very different from Dennett's theory, but it's slightly different way of explaining it. The third possibility could be that brain creates mind, and then mind is actually something that can affect the brain separately. It's now a different entity. But it's not the same as the brain. It's no longer a physical thing, but still is dependent on the physical thing for its existence. So this is the next theory, mentalism. And so this is Dennett considers this his main opponent. Dennett is against this idea. Although this is still a physicalist idea, this still is an idea that everything that exists essentially is physical, and especially that the mind, when the brain ceases, there's no mind. There's no such thing as a mind separate from a brain. However, they're not the same thing. So here we have from Roger Sperry, the whole world of inner experience, the world of the humanities, long rejected by 20th century scientific materialism, becomes recognized and included within the domain of science. So here, it's contrasting itself from materialism. Although from a Buddhist point of view, it would still be considered materialism, it considers itself to be breaking free of that, saying mental processes in consciousness arise from brain activity, emergent properties, but they actually exist and make a difference. They are dynamic. Mental events, like thoughts and feelings, can make things happen in the brain. Therefore, they are neither identical with nor reducible to neural events. But conscious experience cannot exist apart from the physical brain. So an example of an emergent property is liquidity. So if we have molecules of H2O, they don't behave like water. They don't liquid. They're not wet. But if you zoom out, if you have a microscope and you zoom out, then the property of liquidity will emerge on the macroscopic level. So the understanding here is that mind is something like liquidity. It's a macroscopic process that emerges from the microscopic process of neurons in the brain. Now, I think many of you might know Alan Wallace, the Buddhist philosopher. He was a monk before. Now he's still a Buddhist who's a translator and a writer of his own philosophy that is heavily based on Buddhism. And he is also a critic of the materialist standpoint. A lot of you might know that. He's one of the main, almost outspoken people. And his criticism of this, which I think is a very good criticism, is that the problem with this idea of emergence is that specifically when we talk about the emergence of liquidity from water, from H2O molecules, that both liquidity and the molecules can be recognized from the same cognition, namely visual consciousness. You can zoom out from the molecules and you can see the liquidity. Whereas this is not the case with the mind. If you zoom out from the neurons, you see the brain. You still are not seeing the mind. If you didn't know a priori that there was anything like called a mind, you cannot infer its existence from looking at a brain, no matter how much you cut it apart, looked at it under a microscope, or zoomed out. So this becomes a problem in his view. But in mentalism, in this theory, it's understood that it's this is an emergent property. So one proponent of this view, we have John Searle, who, as I said, Dennett this is sort of his arch nemesis. This is when we were his students in college. We joked about this because of the way he talked about John Searle. It was a bit, this is the. I mean, he wasn't mean about it per se, but it was a bit like this is the root of wrong views. Is John Searle, the who lives on the opposite side of the country, because we were at Tufts University in Boston and John Searle was over at Stanford in California, so he had the opposite view. So John Searle, he has this idea that mind, it can't be the same as the brain. It's just too contrary to all of our experience. There's something else going on here. It's something different. And but I wanted to quote something from him because it also is related, to this argument we had yesterday about the Peugeot analogy. As I said, we'd bring these analogies in again. So look at this paragraph from him in his book, Mind, A Brief Introduction. Well, now look at the objects around you, the chairs and the tables, the houses and the trees. These objects are not in any sense subjective. They exist entirely independently of whether or not they are experienced. Furthermore, we know independently that they are entirely made of particles described by atomic physics, that there is no qualitative field to being a physical particle, or for that matter, being a table. They are parts of the world that exist apart from our experiences. So this is very similar to the view of Harari in *Sapiens*, saying that certain things are real and exist, like tables and chairs, and some things like Peugeot are just mind-made. So again, Searle seems to basically be taking this for granted. He's not presenting this as his argument for his ontological theory. He's saying this is what we already know to be true. And then he contrasts this, but with mind, saying that our thoughts and our beliefs don't exist in the same ontological way. He doesn't use the word ontology, but this is the point he's making. Ontology means how we classify what exists versus epistemology, how we know about what exists. So ontology says that, at least in this ontological theory, a table is more ontologically real than a thought. A thought is something that exists only in mind. Well, what does that mean, only in mind? But it implies somehow that something that exists in mind is not real in the real world. And this is something that Nagarjuna, as we'll come to, takes argument with. That I mentioned yesterday with Chandrakirti's philosophy also, saying that you can apply the exact same reasoning to a lion or to a human that you can apply to Peugeot, or to a rock. You can apply the same reasoning. If you search for it among its bases of designation, you can't really find exactly what you're talking about. So next we have substance dualism, which is the theory that's associated with Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Sometimes called Cartesian dualism, this position argues that there are two fundamental kinds of entirely separate substances, mind and matter. So an important word here is substance. This is probably the most important word within the entire text of Dispelling Disputes that we'll get into. Now I've translated the word as nature. The word in Sanskrit, swabhava. Swa means self. And I think bhava, although I don't know Sanskrit, based on the Tibetan translation, which is usually very accurately parallel to the Sanskrit. The Tibetan word is rangjin. So jin means like, or it can also mean face. So either could say the face of the self or like the self. But basically it means that something has a self property, a self entity in and of itself, something that defines it. That's the main point. So in his translation, I mentioned Westerhoff, the translator of this text also. He uses substance because he feels it's a more familiar to Western readers. In Western philosophy, substance has a particular meaning. So it's useful to think of it that way. The reason I choose nature is simply because the word rangjin in almost all Buddhist translations, it's become standard translated as nature, and I think it's generally best not to try to coin one's own translations if there's already an accepted term, because people will get confused if they read other texts. But in any case, the point here is that Nagarjuna rejects any kind of substance, whereas Descartes, when he talks about mind and matter, he talks about them as if they're two substantially different things. That there's a real thing called matter that we can identify and talk about, and there's a real thing called mind, and they exist in completely different realms, and they have their own nature, and they can interact. He identified the mind as controlling the body. I think it's the pineal gland in the brain, but they have their own realms of existence. So in terms of his understanding of mind and matter being different, that actually is how Buddhists would agree with that. That's how they see it. But in terms of his understanding, for example, he says, I think, therefore I am. So therefore, this I that's thinking, what I think this is a real thing. And he identified the I because he said, I experience myself, and this, therefore, it must be real. It's actually more real than matter, because I can only know matter to my experience of it. Whereas if somebody could deceive me and make this whole world could be an illusion, but they cannot deceive me by my experience of myself. Because that's something that's axiomatic. That's my experience itself is self. And he went on to say that experience, the self that I talk about, it's permanent and it's partless. It's a singularity, and it's independent of anything else. It has nothing else in the world has any causal relation to it. So Buddhism would strongly reject this idea. It would be considered the epitome of wrong views of the nature of self. It would be considered that somebody has a wrong experience of self, much in the same way that we experience any object based on its basis of designation and think that it is existing inherently within those. And then based on that experience, therefore creates an entire philosophy that reifies it more and more. That says that self I experience, which in the first place was a mistake, and therefore says that self is permanent, and that self is a singularity, and that self is independent. It makes it more and more real. So this is the philosophy of Descartes, which was later rejected by almost all Western philosophers. But the idea here is that they therefore identify the philosophy of dualism with Descartes. And since basically the 18th century, Western philosophy, which has gone hand in hand with science, has been going away from this idea and seeing this as if we were to accept dualism. Searle, who I just mentioned, John Searle, he specifically says, I cannot accept dualism because it would mean to regress to 300 years back in terms of philosophy. It would be like we'd lose 300 years of progress, that we've been getting away from dualism. So even though his philosophy, Dennett would accuse Searle of being a dualist because he considers mind not to be a material thing, still Searle believes he is not a dualist because he would therefore be going all the way back to the Dark Ages when we still believed in dualism. So this is why we can see there's a very heavy bias against this view. And so it makes it difficult, not just for somebody who's trying to talk, if I was to say, go and have a discussion with a philosopher, but for any of us, we don't realize how much we're influenced by a culture where this is strongly accepted and repeated again and again as an idea of who we are. So next, the last view we have here is dualistic interactionism, which is actually a modern view of dualism. So this is, as I say, it's not very well accepted by other philosophers because they consider this as tantamount to accepting Descartes' philosophy. So this was accepted by, we have here, John Eccles, who was a Nobel Prize winning physicist, or neuroscientist, I guess. I thought he was a physicist too, but I guess I'm not sure exactly what his Nobel Prize was for. I don't remember exactly, but in any case, he teamed up with a philosopher called Popper to write this book, The Self and Its Brain. So since materialist solutions fail to account for our experienced uniqueness, we are constrained to attribute the uniqueness of the psyche or soul to a supernatural spiritual creation. So consciousness and other aspects of mind, which can influence neural events, can occur independently of the brain, generally through the aspects of quantum mechanics. So to be honest, I haven't read his book. Maybe I should. It would be good to get an idea of what he says. But I think I would expect that based on his title, even the self and its brain, that it's a little different from the Buddhist philosophy, which again rejects the idea of a self that's entirely separate. It exists more, in an independent way. That there's not a thing. There's not one thing, one soul, as he uses also, that's controlling things. But there is still a causal process that's not entirely reducible to physical things. But what's very interesting is what he talks about quantum mechanics, because I think, I mentioned that within classical physics, there's no room for a non-material mind because of the closure principle. But the closure principle no longer operates in quantum mechanics. There's room for something else. And so, although it's certainly not the case that quantum theory has come up with a theory of mind that has convinced anybody, at least outside, in a significant degree, it at least gives some possibility that there could be something else. That it's no longer valid really to say that mind cannot be non-material because that's contrary to physics. If somebody could come up with an idea of how the mind functions, related to quantum mechanics, and actually it's very interesting. There's a book I would highly recommend called Quantum Enigma, written by Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner, two physicists, explaining the quantum enigma. What is the problem? How is quantum mechanics challenged our understanding? And at one point in the book, they specifically say, although we do not ascribe to a non-materialist view of mind, certainly quantum mechanics allows for it. And if it turns out that there's evidence showing that mind can exist apart from the brain, then we know how to explain it. We know that we have to look at quantum mechanics. We can't look at classical mechanics. So this, I think is an enormous avenue for exploration, because within the Buddhist view, certainly, there's no explanation of either quantum mechanics or classical physics or neuroscience. These were things that were not really known in ancient India. But there is a very coherent theory of mind. And so it's useful to see whether it could be applied in these contexts. Okay. So finally, we have Nicholas Humphrey. I just wanted to mention this because this is the most relevant statement to the subjects we'll be getting into in the text. Nicholas Humphrey is, again, one other philosopher of mind among many. He's a contemporary of Dennett and Searle. He's very much in the mainstream. This article that I read from him was actually taken from Scientific American, which itself is very heavily materialist, from my impression. So Nicholas Humphrey is certainly a materialist, and he also is of this view of mind being an illusion, which is generally the accepted view because it's no other way to explain, the efficacy of mind within a physicalist view. But then he tries to explain, well, what is his definition of mind? What does he mean? What do you mean when you say mind? We're talking about mind all this time. What do we mean? So he says, I think it is helpful to start by defining consciousness simply as introspective access to mental states. That is to say, you, the subject of consciousness, are conscious of mental states, perceptions, memories, wishes, and so on, just insofar as you know about them by looking into your own mind. So this is presented as a hypothesis, perhaps, a theory of mind. This is highly problematic from a Buddhist perspective. For the one thing, he just said that consciousness is known by looking into your mind. So it's implying that consciousness is what looks into your mind. So he's then saying that consciousness is something different than mind. And he's saying that perceptions, memories, wishes are objects of consciousness. So therefore, they're not consciousness. So actually, there was a last year at the beginning of 2020, there was a discussion in Bangalore. I think some of you were there actually. Between neuroscience, quantum mechanics and Buddhism, but there were also some theories of mind being presented. And there was one philosopher of mind, or I'm not sure exactly what his field was, but he was presenting his theory of mind from Varanasi. And he presented a very similar theory to this. And so I asked him the question, and I wondered at the time, because as I say, for us, it's very natural being in the monastery to debate with people and ask them very pointed questions. Although I wasn't sure if would it be considered entirely appropriate to ask something like this. So he presented this theory. And so I asked him specifically, okay, well, if you said that mind or consciousness is the awareness of feelings, he also used feelings. Humphrey doesn't say feelings here, but he said feelings, perceptions, memories, etc. So if that's the case, but feelings and perceptions are not physical matter, so are feelings and perceptions a third category? Is there something else? Is there mind which experiences feelings, and feelings which experience the external world? Is there a third category? And I got the impression he was actually quite taken aback, that no, he'd never actually thought of that before. And this is why I say I felt a little embarrassed, because I didn't want to put him on the spot. And basically, I think his answer was, well, no, it's all just part and parcel with mind. But then what does that mean? So you've just said that mind experiences perceptions, but now you're saying that perceptions are mind. So that you can't say that the mind is defined as a thing that experiences perception, and then say that perception is just mind. You haven't defined anything. So this comes into the question of self-cognition. As I mentioned several times, this will be one of the major questions in the text. Does mind experience itself? And also the question, I gave this example yesterday of pain. We say, I'm experiencing pain, but is pain anything different than your experience of pain? This is a question that Nagarjuna was dealing with. And this is something that it was a major distinction between his view and the Nyāyā philosophy. But we can see that it's very relevant today, because here is a mainstream, very respected philosopher of mind whose theory of mind is basically that mind is self-cognition. So then a problem also with this, because even the Nyāyā philosophy was not identifying mind as self-cognition. It's then saying that our awareness of external objects is not mind. Our awareness of the external object is mind, but the awareness of the external object is something different, which is completely contrary to our experience. When we talk about mind, what we're talking about is the experience of the object. So then we posit something different than that and say that's what we talk about when we mean mind. So we've gone way beyond what we're even trying to define. So what's this mysterious thing that experiences blue? We see blue. We say, oh, it's the experience of experiencing blue. So I think, yeah, hopefully next time we're going to have to stop here. And I said maybe we get into the first topic today, but actually we've just finished the opening presentation. Now, certainly that was a substantial part of things. I think once we get into the actual topics, it will go a little faster. But I think it's useful then now when we get into the discussion of the actual text to have this background, because this will be one of the major arguments against this particular viewpoint. So we will stop here for today, and next week we can start with the first verses of the text. But if people have questions, I'd be happy to field them. And if you don't have time now, or if you can't think of a question, we'll have all week. So if you want to write questions, please write them in. I guess you could write to Shanti and then she could send them to me. And then I'm happy to respond. And it might actually be easier to give a more detailed answer that way. But if people have questions now, I'd be happy to field a few. So let's see, chat. What about before language existed? The concepts would be fewer than the modern day. So our level of conceptual thinking has only gotten worse. E.g., Western psychology tends to create more concepts with the classification, labeling of a bunch of behaviors as newer and newer disorders. This is an excellent question. And so the first question is, what about before language originated? So this is certainly not something that the Buddhist philosophers neglected. This was a major part of their philosophy. If everything is just merely posited by language and mind, then was there nothing existing before anyone existed? They posit it. And so they have different ways of talking about this. So one is that they say that, for example, it's not only the Madhyamaka philosophers. The Chittamatra, the mind-only school, also has an idea of things being posited by labels and concepts, even though they don't posit it in quite the same way as the Madhyamaka. And so they say that, for one thing, it's not unique to humans. Language is unique to humans, or at least, in their philosophy, it's unique to humans and gods and a few other classes, but it's certainly animals and a lot of other kinds of living beings don't have language. But they still have concepts. So things being posited by language and concepts, it's only posited by language and concepts in the field of the experience of beings who experience things with language and concepts. But in the beings who don't have that, they still posit it through concepts. They still have conceptual idea of certain things. Yes, they give the example of a cow, mother cow, who simply from a scent will identify her young calf. So she has this concept of the calf that when this olfactory sense experiences something, then this concept is triggered, and she behaves in a certain way. And she the cow has a concept of a lion, for example. Animals, they understand about what other animals are. It's not just they see this moving thing and they're frightened. They understand if they exist in a place where lions exist, they know what a lion is. And they know how to actually communicate with each other. There's a lion, be careful. So they have particular concepts that affect their reality, but it's much more simple than ours, which is why their minds are much more simple, and they can't build cities and they can't come up with philosophy. But they still have particular concepts. But then the question is, well, okay, but what about before there was any living thing? So according to Buddhism, there's no such thing as a time where there's no mind. There are places where there's no physical matter, but there's still mind exists. But even if you said that that wasn't the case, that doesn't necessarily present a philosophical problem. It's actually related to, in quantum mechanics, it's the same question. If things can only, a wave function can only collapse when there's a perceiver, then how did the universe originate? So if we talk about the origin of the universe, for example, if we talk about the Big Bang, the early stages of the universe, we're thereby experiencing it. We're not experiencing it with our sense consciousness, but we're experiencing it with our concepts of things. So therefore, it's a field of our experience. So the idea that it existed, like imagine that there was a film projector filming the Big Bang occurring. This is a classical physical interpretation, that there's some kind of frame of reference of something, some field of things just going on a you say a fixed scale of time without anybody experiencing it. But that's now known to be not actually how the universe functions. And according to Buddhism also, according to Nagarjuna, who takes on the concept of time in one of his chapters of Root Wisdom, that the experience of time is a relative thing. I mean, I don't think he's talking about like special relativity, but that it only exists in relation to a particular observer experiencing it that way. Because we experience time in a certain way, we therefore create our whole sense of the universe as an inherent thing, much like I talked about right and left. That we just experience this is how the world is. But the passage of time is only something that's related to a person, a being, a mind experiencing time passing in that way. And so if we talk about the past, it's in relation to a particular thing now. So we can make predictions in science about the past. We can say this thing happened then and then because we now have the evidence now for what would happen in the past. But in that case, we're actually building a conceptual construct. That thing existed then. So in that sense, it doesn't really exist separately from what's existing now. It's just an extension of that. We're extending our frame of reference to include something that we thereby say existed in the past. But then we talk about a language, now it's the present, then it's the past, as if they're two completely separate, independent things. This is why, as Nagarjuna says, our language deceives us. We therefore get very quickly come to the idea that there's two inherently separate things that exist beyond our particular way of talking about them. So for Chittamacha, for the mind-only school, one example would be, that we have things that existed in the past that we name today, but they can still be merely labeled by our concepts. For example, we have dinosaurs, and I don't think they talked about dinosaurs, but it's the same idea. We can say dinosaurs existed, 65 million years ago, and that's true. That's correct. We're saying they existed 20 million years ago is probably incorrect. But nobody had the name dinosaur then. There was no, so in that sense, there was no such thing as the dinosaur. So in some sense, we're creating that story now. It's a true story about something that happened. But in the sense of saying happened, see, it's like I talked about yesterday. We take some kind of, field of experience and then interpret it in a certain way and say this is this thing and this is that thing, and then divide the experience. And some ways of doing that are more close to the reality than others, but in any case, they're not exactly how things exist. So we talk about the Garden of Eden, everything exists already for us to be named. So was there this inherent category called dinosaurs that was just waiting for us to give the name dinosaur? So we have to think about that. Is that how the world exists? Do these categories exist a priori to our grouping the world into particular categories of things? So this isn't quite the same as saying there was no, therefore our naming it made the physical matter, but it has to do with that our naming it then made it exist in a certain way. And so for the Chittamacha anyway, in their presentation, the mind-only school, this is also the case when we talk about objects of mind and mind, that we name this as the object and I am the subject experiencing it. This also is based on a particular way of a framework of thinking about things. And therefore we experience our mind as not being, as being separate from the world that it's experiencing. But in this philosophy, the mind actually, the world is actually a reflection of the mind. Now, Madhyamaka rejects this. So as I say, there's many different ways in Buddhism, there's different ideas, but they do accept the idea that the things are a projection of the mind. The only difference is that they say that it's also not mind. The mind also doesn't exist, really. You can't really find the mind either. But they exist in a dependent relation to each other. You can't really say the thing exists without the mind experiencing it. So then you have the idea, the next question you have here, the concepts would be fewer than the modern day. So our level of conceptual thinking has only gotten worse. If you want to say that, yes, we have more and more concepts, and that's a bad thing, that's not necessarily the case. That's also a difficult question. So this is a very big question in Buddhism and in Indian philosophy in general. If our concepts are the cause of all the problems, then wouldn't it be better if we just didn't have any concepts? So some Indian philosophies and even some interpretations of Buddhism argue, yes, therefore, we should just empty our mind of any concepts. And this is a very popular way that Buddhism is understood in the West, both among people who disagree with it and some people who think that that's a great idea, that we should just therefore not think too much. And not, meditation just means emptying your mind, not having any thoughts, just living day to day, experiencing things exactly as they are with no preconceptions. Now within Buddhism, there are people who have said that. In Tibet, it's usually identified with the philosopher Hashang, who was a Chinese philosopher. But whether that's actually the case, I'm not sure. Tibetan Buddhism has tended to therefore have a bit of a derogatory view of East Asian Buddhism as a result, which is not necessarily true if we look at East Asian Buddhism. But it is definitely the case that there have been Buddhist philosophers who've said that. Whereas there have been others, especially Dharmakirti, was one of the most outspoken ones, saying how wrong this of a view this is. If you look at the Buddhist teachings, he was never saying just don't think. His first teaching was a philosophical teaching about the Four Noble Truths. So Dharmakirti's understanding of this is that although our concepts are distorting reality, the only way to be free of that is through right concepts. So a cow cannot be liberated because a cow can't use philosophy to understand how things really exist. We infer from sensorial experience, we make inferences. And then these inferences are not are an approximation of the sense world, but through inference, we can actually eventually change our experience so that we experience things in a way that is more corresponding to the way things actually exist. So this is Dharmakirti's defense of the use of philosophy within Buddhism. And Tsongkhapa, the Tibetan philosopher, then adopted this very strongly. This is what I said yesterday, that Tsongkhapa's theory of Madhyamaka is much influenced by Dharmakirti as it is by Chandrakirti. Because some people look at Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna's philosophy and say, look, they're saying all these concepts are problems. So therefore they're saying we shouldn't have any concepts. But Tsongkhapa says this is absolutely wrong. It's not inherently existently wrong, but it's completely contrary to what they were saying. It's a very dangerous wrong view. You can't get beyond your concepts without understanding them. It's not a matter of just stopping thinking. This is why we see the example of the Buddha's lifetime, that he went to different meditation teachers who taught him different ways of meditating that essentially meant shutting down your mind. And he mastered these, but then he said, actually, I disagree. This is not liberation. And so he went on to find something else, which was very much a philosophical viewpoint. It's not just that he had an idea, he experienced this directly, but it was, the Buddha taught for 45 years. He didn't just sit in meditation for 45 years and tell people just, if he spoke at all, just say, just meditate like me. He gave all kinds of different teachings that were often, very much worldly. He talked with kings about how to run their empire, and talked with common people about how to live their lives. So it's saying that it's not a matter of letting go of concepts, it's a matter of coming to an understanding. The Buddha said enlightenment, liberation comes not through concentration, although concentration is an essential tool. It comes through wisdom, through understanding how things are. And so at first that wisdom has to be based on concepts, but through training, it can eventually get to the point where it's beyond concepts. And that doesn't mean that you just go off into space. It's like anybody who trains in something. Somebody who first learns how to play basketball has to think very consciously about what they're doing. Because they can't, it's not a natural movement for them. But after 30 years of trading, they don't have to think about it anymore. It's not because they no longer have any concepts, it's because it's become so habitual that they don't have to, consciously think about what they're doing anymore. This is the understanding here, that we go beyond concepts in the sense of we train so strongly in a right way of seeing things that eventually that becomes habitual, and then we come to a greater understanding based on that. So let's see. Yeah, actually, you did ask that question earlier about the DNA. And as your concept in Buddhist terms. So first of all, the potentiality of the DNA. To be honest, yeah. As I say, they don't have a theory of DNA specifically. I mean, that's obvious, but they have a theory of how this generality of things creates the thing. So to be honest, as I said, I really just can't speak for them because I don't understand their philosophy enough. I can say in terms of Buddhist philosophy that His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he asks questions like this, he says that it's more clearly explained in tantric philosophy how this functions. When especially that he thinks that tantric philosophy could give have a lot of good dialogues with genetics. That it's said that okay, so you have this karma, and therefore it creates this formation in the womb. It's talked about the stages of the womb, but it's not so clear in the sutra presentation. In the tantra presentation, there's that whole idea of a subtle body, that there are subtle energies in the body, and therefore this subtle energy, especially the very subtle energy, is something that does not die, and therefore at the time of death, what we call death is really the coarse energies dissolving into the very subtle energy, which continues and then manifests in the new body and associated with a new physical body. And so these subtle energies have certain patterns of movement. So it's like it enfolds into itself, and then it again re-manifests. But its way of, its pattern of the way the energy flows is based on particular habitual ways of doing that. So that would then affect how within the womb, how the physical thing develops. This is, for example, how that would relate to genetics and neuroscience. So we have the formation of the brain over the period both in the womb and then after birth. It continues to evolve. It's actually a problem in genetics because there's only certain a finite number of genes, chromosomes, and of forget the exact word, but within the DNA, there's 25,000, I think, of the human genome. I forget the exact word that I'm trying to search for, but there's 25,000, basically things being encoded. So how can 25,000 of these account for billions of connections and synapses? How can that information be encoded in that? So this is one of the arguments actually that's been made by some of the people against this idea of the mind being purely a product of genetics. So here we can see that it's actually been shown very clearly that thinking can affect the formation of the brain. If we think in a certain way, then it will affect how the synapses evolve, especially among children, but even among adults, there's now understood to be neuroplasticity in the brain. But the brain can change based on thinking. It does. It's not that it can, it always does. But certain habitual thoughts, as they get stronger and stronger, it changes more. So if we understood the mind to be this energy that's non-physical, but that interacts in a dynamic way with the physical, then if there's certain patterns of thinking that are carried over from a previous life, this would then affect the evolution of the brain. So then we might argue, well, we always see this particular brain structure in people who have such and such style of thinking or mental disorder. But really it's a question of, is that a cause, which is causing which? It's not necessarily the case that therefore this person had this brain structure and therefore they think this way. It could be that they're predisposed to think this way, and therefore this particular style of structure in the brain improves. So this would be the Buddhist understanding, which, as I say, is more dynamic and interdependent. Whereas perhaps the Nyāyā would say that it's all programmed ahead of time, and it's just like, it's like a computer program that just says, okay, now do this, and the body just evolves in that exact particular way, which would be perhaps harder to explain now that we understand that there's a lot of genetic carryover, from the parents. There's hereditary things, so it's not functioning in a purely independent environment. It has certain constraints based on the the physicality of it. So it can't just be 100% one-way causality, which is what they seem to imply, that the physical world is just 100% a reflection of this more subtle world. Okay. Measure of concept in Buddhist terms. Basically, so in English, we have the word concept. We can either mean by a concept an idea, which is like an object of mind, or we can mean a conceptual consciousness, which is a mind that has an idea. It's not very clearly distinguished. This is actually a problem. This is again how our language can become a problem for us. It can make us therefore experience things in a certain way. And in Buddhist philosophy, it's much more clearly delineated. A dokpa is the word in Tibetan, which I think is, actually, I forget the Sanskrit. Maybe somebody knows. It is a conceptual consciousness. And a dokpe nangwa, which means the appearance to a conceptual consciousness, which is also called a denchi, which means a meaning generality. So there's two different things. There's the meaning generality, which is what appears to the consciousness, and there's the consciousness, which is the one that experiences that. So in terms of its nature, the dokpa, the conceptual consciousness, is no different from a perception, a direct perception. In munzum, it's called, which is a direct perception. So it's not like there's substantially two different things. They're only defined actually in terms of what's appearing to them. So a conceptual consciousness is a consciousness that has the appearance of a meaning generality, which means that, for example, we have a pot I mentioned, is that the Nyāyā school understands the generality of pot to be something that's not posited by mind. But in this system, it's understood that there is a generality of pot, but it doesn't exist until we conceive of it. So we see a lot of things that look similar, and then we therefore create an idea of those. That is a generality, that we say it mixes them. It's mixed in terms of time, place, and nature. So nature means that we see green pots and red pots and blue pots, but they're all mixed in one concept of a generality of a pot. And place, both in terms of like plots at different places, but especially a pot is spatially, it exists over its space, it's how do you say? It exists sort of splayed over a large space. It's not just in one singularity, but we conceive of it as a singularity. It's conceived as a static singular thing. And similarly with time, a pot has a trajectory. It has, when we first made it up to when it's broken, it's changing constantly at a microscopic level. But we mix it in our concept as a singular permanent thing. Things appear to our conceptual consciousness as permanent. So that it appears permanent, it appears singular, and it appears as an independent thing that's independent of all the manifestations of it, which is why conceptual consciousness is considered to be mistaken. That conceptual image that we have appears to be the real thing. It doesn't mean we believe it is, but it's just by the very nature of the conceptual consciousness, the thing appears in a mistaken way. The problem is that we think about it so much, we come up with all of these categories that we forget that we're the one making them. And therefore, it starts to affect how we experience the world. So although things don't appear to us, for example, as permanent, our eye consciousness does not have an experience of permanence. The pot appearing to our eye consciousness actually changes moment to moment, but we're so habituated to a conceptual appearance of it that it doesn't appear to change. So for example, if I see somebody 10 years later and they look different than they did 10 years ago, I'm surprised because I have a concept of them that is static. So therefore I experience the world very much as if it should be how it appears to my conceptual consciousness. This is a very complex thing, and I will stop there because I could go on for years. Actually, this is what we studied for years and years. But there's one more thing to say, is that this is a critical distinction between Chandrakirti. So when I say Chandrakirti, really what I mean, I'm trying to also express Nagarjuna's philosophy, because this is our understanding of Nagarjuna's philosophy as interpreted by Chandrakirti. It's basically how we understand Nagarjuna, but it's just not as clearly delineated in that philosophy. A major difference between Chandrakirti and the Madhyamaka philosophy and all other Buddhist philosophers is saying that conceptual consciousness, although it is mistaken because the meaning generality appears that way, it still correctly apprehends what appears to it. It is because, for example, I can say I'm thinking of a pot. So if I was mistaken to what appears to my consciousness, my thought consciousness, how can I then talk about, well, I experienced this and I'm right? So all the other philosophies have problems with that. And this is actually why they have to posit self-cognition. But in Chandrakirti's philosophy, it's possible to both be mistaken to something and to apprehend it, because it's the same, actually. Although thought consciousness is different than sense consciousness, they are the same in that they both are mistaken to the object, yet still apprehend it. So that, that's just, might just sound like words. I think we could go on for, as I say, it's a very complex thing, but this is very important in terms of understanding the negation of self-cognizers, which will definitely come up either in the next talk or the one after that.
The term concept comes up here quite regularly. Okay. And are you suggesting that concept and conceptual consciousness are mutually inclusive?
Well, are you saying it comes up regularly in your studies, like you've seen the term in a lot of texts?
Well, no, it's just the discussion comes up, such as somebody will say, "Oh, time is a concept," right. And I say, "Well, but that's a non-associated compositional factor." And then someone might say, "Well, so if it's a non-associated compositional factor, it's necessarily a concept. So it would follow that Paul is a concept, and a concept can have a drink, and that doesn't seem to work." And it's it keeps going round and round and round, and I can't answer to myself. I can't give a satisfactory answer to myself. But if we say in the Buddhist terms that concept is mutually inclusive with conceptual consciousness, well, from the Buddhist point of view, then it's quite clear. But from what
I think the problem is that when people use the word concept, that's not necessarily what they mean. So I guess I'm saying that if we want to define concept as synonymous with conceptual consciousness, then it's very clear what the Buddhist philosophy would say about it. But the problem is that I think often when people speak about concepts, sometimes they're referring to conceptual consciousness, and sometimes they're referring to meaning generalities. So sometimes people say that they think, they'll say, I understand Madhyamaka philosophy, because it's saying that everything that exists is just a concept. But then you might ask, well, what do you mean by concept? Do you mean conceptual consciousness? And they might say, okay, yes. So then you could, as you say, you respond, well, is that everything exists a mind? Because everything's a concept, and concept is a mind. That doesn't work. So yeah, it really depends on what, and if someone says concept, you have to ask, what specifically do you mean by a concept? And to clearly define that there's a difference between conceptual consciousness and appearance to conceptual consciousness. And oftentimes concept is used interchangeably with those two.
So if Venerable Gache has can we say he has a concept that it's warm in Paul's room? That actually sounds like
a conceptual consciousness, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I have a belief that it's warm in your room.
Yeah.
But you could also say there's an appearance to my mind. I have that particular appearance.
To the meaning generality.
It's not entirely clear. Yeah, meaning generality.
Yeah. But the meaning generality isn't.
No, it's not mind. It's actually permanent. It's a permanent phenomenon. It's not functional. It's something posited by mind.
Okay. Because the usual one is things like, well, time is a concept, you see. And again, I'm probably
right, exactly.
I'm probably repeating myself.
Either way, if you say time is a concept, if concept means conceptual consciousness, then you have to say time is mind, which is not. Yeah. Or if you say time is a meaning generality, then you say time is permanent, which it also is not. So it doesn't work either way.
No. So concept and yeah, okay, yeah. So concept and non-associated compositional factor mutually exclusive. Concept and conceptual consciousness mutually inclusive.
I guess, as I say, if that's how we want to define it, I guess I would say, if I was going to translate a Buddhist text, I probably wouldn't translate anything as concept, because it doesn't quite. It's the English words that we have to refer to mind. A lot of them are not specific enough to be able to express what the specificity of some of the Buddhist concepts. Once we decide on it, it's okay. If we were all to agree, okay, we'll use concept to translate conceptual consciousness, we all know what we're talking about when we define it, then that would work. But other than that, it's a bit problematic to use it as a concept, as a vocabulary, because we have to be very clear what we're defining.
So okay, so it's still not super clear to me.
It's not clear to you, you said.
It's not super clear to me. If you wouldn't use the word concept, if you was translating a text, you wouldn't use the term concept to translate conceptual consciousness. Then
I said I wouldn't, just because I don't think people might not understand what I'm trying to say. They might think that I mean the object of conceptual consciousness. Okay. If we all agree ahead of time that's how we're going to translate it, and we get used to that translation, and we have an agreed upon definition of it, then that would be okay.
And clearly, there's no definition of it. I'm sure you would have seen.
As I say, I haven't seen it used in translations that I consider authoritative.
Yeah.
As I was asking if you've seen it in one, and I'd have to look at what they're translating and what actually word in Tibetan they're translating.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, there's other questions coming up, but maybe what we can do is, as I say, we can, if you want to write them in to Shanti, and then she can send them to me. I'm happy during the week to gradually respond, and that also maybe will help people, who it seems other people are having to leave anyway now, and I have to go have lunch in India. But yeah, I'm happy to, during the week, as I have time, I can respond. And I think in writing, it might often be clearer. And then we can meet next Saturday at 11. So we'll be starting with the first verse of the text. And so I think I've sent out the translation that I made of the root text. So if you happen to have a chance, if you can look through it just to get an idea, it might not make sense, but just be familiar with what's being said. You'll see that the root text, it's 20 verses of debate, followed by 50 verses or 51 verses of response. But in terms of the teaching, we'll go through it because, like, for example, verse 1 is then responded to by verse 21. So rather than doing verse 1 and then reading through all these debates, we'll do verse 1, then immediately read verse 21 to get, to respond, see what was responding to what. But other than that, let's actually, we still have to do the closing prayers. So thank you all for coming. And I hope you have a good and a safe week there. I hope I'm still here next week to continue on next Saturday. Okay. May the precious supreme bodhicitta not yet born arise. May that arisen not decline but increase more and more. Samsara and nirvana, like even additive inherent existence, and cause and effect independent arising are and betraying. I seek your blessings to discern the meaning of Nagarjuna's thought, that these two are mutually complementary, not contradictory. However many sick sentient beings there are, may they quickly be freed from all sicknesses. May all sicknesses without an exception of transmigratory beings never occur again. In all my life, never separated from perfect gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma. May I complete in the qualities of the grounds and paths, may I quickly attain the state of Vajradhara. By the force of the victorious one, Tsongkhapa, act as my direct Mahayana virtuous friend in all my lives. May I never turn away for even a second from the pure path, highly admired by the victorious ones. May I and all sentient beings meet the pre-teachings of the victorious one Losang Drakpa, who lived an eminent life endowed with pure morality, a brave heart in doing the Bodhisattva's extensive deeds, and the yoga of the two stages, the supreme transcendental wisdom of non-dual bliss and voidness. Like the earth, water, fire, and wind, medicines and wood in the forest, may I always be enjoyed by all sentient beings as I like and without resistance. May I hold sentient beings as dear as my life. May sentient beings hold me most dear. May all the negative karma ripen on me, and may all the virtue ripen on them. As long as any sentient being has not been liberated from samsara, may I abide in samsara to help them, even though I achieve highest enlightenment. May I become like a wish-granting jewel, fulfilling all the wishes, and like a wish-granting tree, fulfilling all the hopes of transmigratory beings. By merely seeing, hearing, or thinking about or remembering me, as well as by touching or talking to me, may all suffering instantly be pacified, and may there be happiness forever. Due to all the past, present, and future merits collected by me, the numberless Buddhas, numberless sentient beings, which are completely empty of existing from their own side, may I, who am completely empty of existing from my own side, achieve the state of full enlightenment, which is completely empty of existing from its own side, and lead all sentient beings, who are completely empty of existing from their own side, to that state which is completely empty of existing from its own side by myself alone, who are completely empty of existing from my own side. I fully dedicate all these virtues to be able to train, just like the hero Manjushri who knows reality, and just like Samandabhadra as well. I fully dedicate all merits of virtue with the dedication praised as the best by all the gone victorious ones of the 3 times in order to have good conduct. For the Dharma King Tsongkhapa's way of Dharma to flourish, may all signs of obstacles be pacified and all conducive conditions be complete. Due to the 2 types of merits of the 3 times of myself and others, may the teachings of the victorious one Losang Drakpa shine resplendent forever. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gache, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, may you have a long life, and may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. He who upholds the Sadhu's moral way serves the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjuna's victorious doctrine. In favor of myself and others, your disciples, please live long. Okay, so thank you, everybody. So we'll see you all next week, hopefully.
10th of July. And thank you, Venerable. Thank you, all of you, and have a virtuous July 6th as well. His Holiness's birthday.
Thank you,
Thank
Venerable.
you.